The correct title would be Pre-Philo, but I'm not quite sure how to style this. You can see from the desk that talking intelligently, or supposedly intelligently, about this era is almost impossible. And we have an array of about 35 books here, which are all relevant and should all be brought in, and cannot be. So the only tack to take is the tack that the jeweler takes, to try and cut along the facets and hope not to destroy the gem. So I'm going to start at a discovery place. One of the most important books in antiquity was by Cicero, and it was called De Re Publica, On the Republic. And he wrote it right at the end of his life, knowing he was going to be killed. He wrote it in 43 BC, and he had spent the whole summer of 43 BC delivering orations and publishing the written text of the orations, condemning Mark Antony for being a demagogue. And they're known as the Philippics. And Cicero pointedly, again and again, says this is the end of the Republic, that it ends with men taking advantage of power and creating parties which cause sedition. And at the very end of De Re Publica, in Book 6, he went into the philosophy of why this was so. But Book 6 of De Re Publica was lost, and you have to put quotation marks around that. The truth is that the Vatican manuscript of Cicero does not have Book 6. It was either lost or was conveniently lost. And only fragments survived. And the few fragments that survive are some of the most important writing in the world. The largest group of pages that survived were called the Dream of Scipio. And the Dream of Scipio was the most famous cosmological prophetic writing of the classical world, and influenced tremendously the new ecumenical world that came after Jesus. We have talked a couple of times about the change in structure, how in fact the BC centuries, as we move on down to what would have been 0 BC, of course we go from 1 BC to 1 AD, there was no 0. The term that is most applicable to the kinds of structures that were made mentally, psychically, politically, were gathering up. And the Greek word that is used for this is the origin of the word logos. But the Greek word for this gathering up was lego, L-E-G-O, lego. And be careful now not to think of Lagos, because Lagos in Greek meant lewd. Lewd. The lewd word. But lego meant to gather up, to pick up, put together. And it's much like the structure that we've been talking about braiding traditions together. And that was the kind of syncretism, that was the structure that was there before Christ. And immediately after Christ, there's a change in the possibilities of structure. There's a change in the mental structuring of the world. Instead of a gathering up, instead of a lego, there's an interweaving and making a fabric of vision, so that the language that was used at that time, logos, takes the term legos, but takes a verbal form of it and makes a noun out of it. So that logos, rather than meaning the word, is that which has been gathered and to a unity. So that the Logos, which became a favorite doctrine, of course, is a very poignant doctrine, but it's more poignant as a numinous occurrence than as a doctrine. And I guess that's the crucial understanding that we have to make tonight, that this change, this alchemical change of the Spirit, was so profound, and because it was structurally different, there were many intelligent people who followed the implications of the change, but who could not make the change. And early Christianity is exactly the mysterious focus where this bifurcation happens. And as the centuries go on, we will see that this split does nothing but widen and fortify itself. And there is an esoteric and there is an exoteric movements, which have their origins in only one individual, and that was Jesus. There simply is no other individual that we can turn to who was significant enough, who could have made both that alchemical change and harbored this bifurcation in a single unity. In Cicero's De Re Publica, some of the fragments that were culled from other classical authors talk about the structure of the Republic, which was disappearing and turning into the empire. Within 11 years, Augustus would cement his hold, and by 19 BC, the Roman Empire would be a fact. Here's what Cicero wrote, and these are all missing from the Vatican manuscript. What you look for, then, is an account of this ruling statesman's prudence in its entirety, a quality which derives its name from foreseeing. And prudentia comes from pro video, this ability to foresee what is going to happen. So prudence is not just being conservative, but it's actually being able to foresee. How can one foresee? Because there are patterns. The patterns that are there in a fabric of life were not there as long as things were just gathered up. As long as Lego was operating, there were no patterns. There was just holding power as much as you could. But with the change to Logos, the universe, man's essential nature, was now patterned and one could understand. And the difference in this is pointed out by Jesus himself in the Gospel according to Mark, in the 13th chapter of Mark, where he tells the disciples that the changes that are coming are the most profound changes that have ever been in the world, that there never again will be changes as profound. And he says, you'll be dragged in front of courts, both in the synagogues and in the courts. But don't worry about what you're going to say. You will say whatever comes out from the Holy Spirit on the moment. Now this is very poignant, because this is setting aside all of the Lego. This is setting aside all of the gathered up traditions, setting the law aside for a kind of existential freedom, which is a intelligent pivot at any moment in which it occurs. And this is the Holy Spirit. And this is different. It is a totally different structure. But in order to trust oneself as a human being to this, takes a certain transformation. And in order for a community of human beings to trust to this, the whole community must be transformed. And this is the crux of the problem. We're going to come back to Cicero now for just a moment. More quotations missing from the Vatican manuscript, filled in later on. Wherefore this citizen must see to it that he is always armed against those influences which disturb the stability of the state. The individual has to remain alert, vigilant. How? By learning the pattern. There's now a possibility of a pattern. There will be a pattern of wholesomeness. And such a dissension among the citizens in which one party separates from the rest is called sedition. The constant emphasis will be on unanimity, on the community operating from a unanimous understanding, which is achieved, this unitas is achieved by everyone having undergone the transformation, so that they see in terms of the overall pattern, in terms, in fact, of a universal pattern, and not in terms of limited perspectives that would allow for party politics or would allow for personal self-aggrandizement. Both of these levels are going to be handled at the same time in the same way. Both are going to be transformed. And the context that allows them to be transformed is the fact that the universe has now matured to a point to where it has transformed. Cicero writes, "For our desires are hard masters over our thoughts, compelling and commanding us to do an infinite number of things. And as these desires can never be appeased or satisfied in any way, they urge to every sort of crime those whom they have inflamed by their allurements." In other words, in the nature of desires and druthers based on an untransformed individual or an untransformed community, there's no end to the complications. There is, by design, by structure, no end to those complications. Hence, the transformation is going to be an archetypal recalibration of possibility. It is now going to be possible to be whole. It's going to be possible to be whole as an individual. It's going to be possible to have a whole community, and that the universe as a unitas is now made whole. Against Cicero, we need to posit in here now an observation on the nature of the Gospels. Cicero was writing that in 43 BC, leaving a legacy the best that he could. Part of the legacy that he was leaving was 6 volumes of philosophy that recounted the cream of the ancient classical understanding. Besides De Republica, he did a volume called De Natura Deorum, on the nature of the gods, which recounted all of the major philosophical standpoints of his day. And in particular there, the Epicurean and the Stoic cosmologies were explained and given in what we would call simple language. These formulations by Cicero would influence Philo of Alexandria enormously. In fact, it's of some synchronistic coincidence that Cicero's teacher in Stoic matters was also named Philo. And Philo of Alexandria was named for this Philo, just like Philo of Alexandria's brother was named Alexander. The wealthy man, Philo's brother, was the one who financed Herod Agrippa, the grandson of Herod the Great. Lent him something like 200,000 sesterces so that he could be a power. The nephew of Philo, one of the 2 sons of Alexander, was the governor of Judea after Pontius Pilate. So that this family was extremely powerful and potent. And we've talked about how the Jewish community of Alexandria was extremely powerful. Philo estimates their numbers at 1 million people more than the population of Jews everywhere else in the world. By 117 AD, there were very few Jews left in Alexandria because of a revolt, and the emperor at that time was Trajan, who simply eradicated the problem, uprooted people. This uprooting kind of a tendency appears as a key in this break, in this split around 25 to 45 AD. And probably the easiest way to remember and to keep track of this is that magical words, power words, amulet inscription, spell-breaking words began to be carved at that time interchangeably in Greek and Aramaic and Hebrew. And within another 50 years, Latin was added to it. Some of these magical words at this time are extremely interesting when they're looked at. I'll give you just one, and maybe you can avail yourself of some of this information later on and do something with it. The word I'm going to give you was akramachamare. 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 You can find it in the discussion by Gershom Scholem on page 94 of his book Jewish Gnosticism, Merkaba Mysticism and Talmudic Tradition. I won't go into the whole discussion that he has here, but he says this is a very interesting word because it is carved in the gem that we have in Greek, and that most people have assumed that this had something to do with the Greek and Coptic background because it was found in Egypt, near Alexandria. But in fact, the word does not make sense in Greek. The word makes sense in Aramaic. And in Aramaic, the word means somewhat that which is an uprooter of the nets of spells. Spells were considered to be mental nets put over people, so that the more you struggled against them, the tighter you were bound. Because by recognizing them as a net, as having been caught, you were caught. The uprooting of the nets was recognizing that you were not caught. That what is there of you that can be caught by such a thing? That realization took a transformation. And the individual transformation, when we use the Greek term metanoia, but we're going to move over to the Greek term gnosis, that the metanoia, the change of mind, produced a gnosis, produced a knowing, a seeing, so that one was no longer nettable. The startling thing is that one was no longer nettable not only by curses or by spells, but also not nettable by laws anymore, not nettable by the state politics, not nettable by the kind of community that Ibsen used to write against, the kind of community that tries to keep the individual under their thumb. One was completely freed from this. This, of course, is dynamite, or as we talked about last week, we called it nitroglycerin. In the Gospel of Mark, in the 13th chapter, and this is actually the culmination in the Gospel of Mark, after that is the Passion story. They're leaving the temple, Mark writes, and one of the disciples remarks, "Look, Master, what huge stones, what fine buildings." And Jesus says to him, "You see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left on another. All will be thrown down." So they go off. And of course, anything that the Master says, especially something poignant like this, they're talking about, and they don't understand. So Mark records that later, when he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, facing the temple, up, still in Jerusalem, but up on the Mount of Olives, and they're all sitting around, probably taking a repast, he was questioned privately by Peter, James, John, and Andrew. Sounds like a delegation, right? Well, we don't know what he means. Well, go and ask him. Well, I'm not going to ask him. Well, all right, let's get a committee and go up, talk to him, ask him. Tell us, they said, when will this happen? It's very interesting. When will this happen? And then to cover themselves, what sign when the fulfillment of all this is at hand? They're asking a double question here. They're asking for a calendar date. And they're also asking for an omen. And now Jesus is going to tell them that this kind of an event has no calendar date, and this kind of event has no sign. There are no omens for this sort of thing. That world where there were omens is not going to happen here. This event is not in that kind of calendar time. It's not in that kind of a net where there are still omens. This is different. But they're not going to be able to hear him. But Mark, John Mark, is able not only to hear, but to understand enough to put it down in such a way that it comes off the page after about 1930 years. It still comes off the page. He writes, Jesus began, take care that no one misleads you. First thing, it's like Hollywood Boulevard alertness. Watch out for the scams. Before he tells them anything. Many will come claiming my name, saying, I am he, and many will be misled by them. When you hear, he's going to give them a little parable now, when you hear the noise of battle near at hand, and the news of battles far away, do not be alarmed. Such things are bound to happen, but the end is still to come. For nation will make war upon nation, kingdom upon kingdom. There will be earthquakes in many places, famines. With these things, the birth pangs of a new age begin. As for you, be on your guard. You will be handed over to the courts. You will be flogged in the synagogues. You will be summoned to appear before governors and kings on my account, to testify in their presence. Notice here now, you will be flogged in synagogues. Why? Because you are going oblique to the law. You're no longer operating within the law. You will be brought before governors and kings. Who was brought before governors and kings in John Mark's experience? The only disciple that was brought before governors and kings was Paul. He was the one. And remember that every time Paul was pressed to the issue of transformation and disclosing that he was now siding in a different realm, he did not. He said, you can't do this to me. I'm a Roman citizen. Luke, who was a Syrian doctor, he was born in Apamea, the same place that Posidonius, the great Stoic, was born and raised in, says again and again in both Acts and alludes to it in the Gospel of Luke that the Romans were extremely cautious about Roman citizens because their law was as important as the Jewish law to them. He says in Mark, so when you are arrested and taken away, don't worry beforehand what you will say, but when the time comes, say whatever is given to you to say. For it is not you who will be speaking. It will be the Holy Spirit. Brother will betray brother to death, and the father his child. Children will turn against parents and send them to their death. All will hate you for your allegiance to me, but the man who holds out to the end will be saved. So he tells them this, and they're not seeing this. Peter, John, James, and Andrew, the closest core of the disciples, are not seeing this. So Mark reverses the field. He reverses the field totally, and he has Jesus say, but when you see the abomination of desolation, usurping a place which is not his, then those who are in Judea must take to the hills. Now he's talking about signs. And the abomination of desolation is a play on words. In the Greek it meant Zeus in heaven. And it was used in the book of Daniel to take this phrase, Zeus in heaven, and twist it around into a Hebrew phrase that meant the abomination that creates desolation. He says, if a man is on the roof, he must not come down into the house to fetch anything out. If in the field, he must not turn back for his coat. As for women with child in those days, and for those who have children at the breast, pray that it may not come in winter. For those days will bring distress such as never been seen until now, since the beginning of the world, which God created, and will never be again. This is a culmination. This is a transformative point. And what's being transformed here is that what has been historical, what has been capable of being gathered up, is going to be changed, alchemically changed. There's not going to be the same kind of history anymore. There's not going to be a history which can be gathered up anymore. There's going to be a unified field which has an eternal aspect to it, which is not dependent upon historical vicissitudes. That the individual who is still identifying himself with historical processes, who is still identifying himself with legal precedents, who still somehow identifies himself with the exoteric structure, is going to be lost. He says, no one would be able to survive this period if it had not been cut short. That this is the only way that anybody is going to survive this. And he says, no one knows when this is coming. And he specifically says, not the angels, nor the Son, but only the Father. That there is no time to this. There's no way to have a prediction on this. One of the basic reasons, and we use the term ratio here, one of the basic reasons for this transformation, the necessity for it, was that the structures that had been gathered up had become polluted, had become completely polluted by what we have traced for the last 3 or 4 months, an increasing awareness on the part of man that there were demonic forces in the world, that these demonic forces, these evil spirits that were made not from creation but from the mixing of angels and men, the watchers, the whole realm that the Enoch books go into, that this demonology had proliferated so much by this time. Whether it was in fact or not is actually beside the point, because it was psychologically so. The crux of the matter focused around the fact that there was no longer anything pure to gather up. So everything had to be changed, so that the structure was purified by its unity. And it was this core that was to prove a problem for the disciples. And the first person to really understand this was John Mark. And probably Philo's presence in Alexandria, his writings in Alexandria, were the crowning material or data that helped John Mark to see this vision. So the relationship between Philo and Mark is crucial to understanding the origins of esoteric Christianity. And that was purely an Alexandrian understanding for a long time. And when we get to it, within a month, I hope we can get to Clement of Alexandria. He is the last person who still understands this Alexandrian synthesis, as we could call it now, this transformation. It used to be that we thought that the synoptic gospels were the everyday gospels and that the Gospel of John was the esoteric gospel. But in fact, the Gospel according to John is actually very much in the old Jewish tradition. In fact, the arrangement of the Gospel of John takes the triennial, the 3-year cycle of the Jewish synagogue lectory sermon cycle and puts it into the Gospel form as its structure. So that if you read through the Gospel of John without knowing the lectory cycle in the synagogues of Judaism of that time, it seems to you very mystifying that somehow John must be talking mystically. But in fact, he carefully chooses all of his examples, and they usually run along in a formula of a feast, a ceremony, a celebration throughout the ritual year, which is not a single year but a 3-year cycle. And it runs feast, then miracle, and then discourse. So that reading through John, the Gospel of John, one could take the Gospel of John and use it as the sermon liturgy in Jewish synagogues. And it could be read within the cycle so as to displace the old understanding of the festivals. Now, this is what we would call reform. This is reform. This is not gnosis. This is reform. And no matter how admirable it is, no matter how well done it is, and the Gospel of John is extremely well done, it does not produce the transformed individual. The Gospel of Luke was almost a complete rewriting of Mark. In fact, in the church from the late 2nd century up until about the 5th century AD, very often you would find only Matthew, Luke, and John. Some of the earliest testaments, New Testaments, were where the Gospels were bound together. And we have many examples where those 3 Gospels are bound together and Mark is not with them. In fact, the first examples, the oldest examples that we have of a collected Gospel like that are from around 150 AD. I think it was Justin Martyr who might have done this. Or Marcion might have had a hand in this. And the Gospel of Mark is left out. And Luke is largely a process of making Mark dispensable. We saw that more than 80% of the words that are in Mark are in Luke. But the arrangement of the words, the import of Mark, is totally different from that of Luke. The Gospel of Luke is a prelude, is a setting for the Acts. And the Gospel of Luke and the Acts were actually one book. And you can't really appreciate Luke without having Acts. And Acts, when you read through it, focuses finally upon the doings of Paul. The whole end of the Acts has now channeled all the disciples into Paul, so that the Gospel of Luke runs in a pattern which finally funnels down to Pauline Christianity. And Paul, like John, was a reformer. Always went to the synagogues first, always thought that this was the basic commitment, and that delivering the good news to the Gentiles was a secondary operation, and would always specifically say, I shake the dust off in front of you to let you know I have come here first. And I go there only because this is a rejection by you, and perhaps they will receive it. The spreading of Pauline Christianity went first to Antioch. And it was in Antioch that the Christian church as a structure of Reformed Judaism was born. But it was in Alexandria at the very same time that transformed man, universal man, was recognized. And the difference between Antioch and Alexandria is exactly contemporaneous, is the difference between the development finally of the Alexandrian vision of transcendent man becoming a universal, the understanding of the Christos. And Antiochian Christianity is the understanding of Jesus as the culminating rabbi, the teacher, who leaves in his place the church. Whereas in Alexandria, the Christos has been transformed and the Holy Spirit is where it will be. It doesn't have to have a building. It doesn't have to have any kind of a structure whatsoever in terms of the world. There's no politics in Alexandrian gnosis. But in the Antiochian Christianity, more and more, it is the structure of the church that becomes paramount in the minds of individuals. The structure of this church, strangely enough, was based upon Stoic physics and not upon Jewish cosmology. And the structure of the Christian church, in its development, as it grows and as it comes into its maturity by the time of the 400s, Augustine's time, is actually an adaptation of a Stoic cosmology rather than having anything to do at all with an inner transformation, a gnosis. Probably the best description of Stoic physics, because almost all those documents were destroyed. None of them survived. You talk about book burnings, none of them survived. The only thing that survived was another book of Cicero's. And a little note here. Why does Cicero survive? Because it was held that he was good for boys to learn to write. That he wasn't an earth-shaking philosopher. He wasn't dangerous like Posidonius. Now, if Posidonius's works had survived, they would really have been something. The feeling was that Cicero is good for educating boys, so let's not press. Let's keep him around. Augustus Caesar, who was the one who let Antony have Cicero, sacrifice Cicero, used to have a gentle smile whenever he would see his grandchildren reading Cicero as little boys. He didn't have anything to worry about, so he thought. But Cicero, if I can find De Natura Deorum, gives us a complete rundown of Posidonius' Stoic cosmology. And it's very interesting, because one can also call it a Stoic theology. And the theological structure of Stoic cosmology is the one that the Christian church finally adopted for itself, and, in fact, structured the expectation of a holocaust of fire at the end of the world. The whole thing of an apocalyptic end of the world is actually a Stoic doctrine. It has nothing whatsoever to do with Christianity. It has nothing whatsoever to do with what was taught by Jesus. The Stoics held that the universe is controlled by God, not a God, but by God, and in the last resort is God. The sole ultimate reality is the divine mind, which expresses itself in the world process. But only matter exists, for only matter can act and be acted upon. Notice how subtle the changes are, how it goes from a monotheistic standpoint to a historical standpoint to a materialistic standpoint. It's very, very potent material. The greatest criticism of this, incidentally, if you remember, was in Plutarch. And Plutarch took Stoic physics to the wall because he said this is absolutely amoral. That if men believe this, they will believe anything. And we have to train our minds to understand that this is a non sequitur of absurdities when really looked at. And Plutarch is speaking from someone who was a priest of the mysteries, the transformative mysteries. Only matter exists, for only matter can act and be acted upon. Mind, therefore, is matter in its subtlest form. Well, we come across that doctrine in our time so many times, it's just pitiful. Mind is just matter in the subtlest form. This is anti-spiritual. This is psychism. Therefore, fire or breath or ether is the ultimate mind stuff. The primal fiery spirit creates out of itself the world that we know, persists in it as its heat or soul or tension, is the cause of all movement and all life, and ultimately the cause of a universal conflagration which will reabsorb the world into itself, but there will be no pause. At once the process will begin again, unity will again pluralize itself, and all will repeat the same course as before. Mark this is deterministic. This has nothing whatsoever to do with nature. This is a mental net. So existence goes on forever in endlessly reoccurring cycles. Endlessly reoccurring cycles. If one believed this, if one really believed this, your emotional reaction would be ultimate despair. Ultimate despair. Think of Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus. But now raise that up to a theological level. And this endlessly reoccurring cycle follows a fixed law, a fixed formula. And here is where Cicero uses the term logos. The formula is the logos. The logos. This law is then fate or providence ordained by gods, and the Stoics said that the Logos is God, and the universe perfectly good, badness is only apparent, evil only means the necessary imperfection of the parts viewed separately from the whole. Also denies the reality of evil. If you deny the reality of evil, you also must deny the reality of good. And the first of the Four Noble Truths is that suffering is real. Evil is real. Otherwise you never do anything real about it. If you believe it's just an occurrence, well, what's to worry? This is a very subtle trap. This is a real net. It's a real curse. All of this was explained in Cicero and De Natura Deorum, and survived because it was used as a school textbook. He writes in here about Epicurus, who was one of the greatest of the Stoics. And he says, obviously Epicurus thinks, as spoilt children do, that idleness is the best thing there is, because God is supposed to be free from trouble. Yet these very children, even when idle, amuse themselves for some act of gain. Are we to suppose that God enjoys so complete a holiday and is so sunk in sloth that we must fear lest the least movement may jeopardize his happiness? This language not merely robs the gods of the movements and activities suitable to the divine nature, but also tends to make men slothful, even if God cannot be happy when actively employed. However, granting your view that God is the image and likeness of man, what is his dwelling place? What is his local habitation? In what activities does he spend his life? What constitutes that happiness which you attribute to him? For a person who is to be happy must actively enjoy his blessing. As for locality, even the inanimate elements each have their own particular region. Earth occupies the lowest place, water covers the earth, to air is assigned the upper realm, and the ethereal fires occupy the highest confines of all. So about your deity, I want to know, where does he dwell? Secondly, what motive he has for moving in space, that is, if he ever does so move. Thirdly, it being a special characteristic of animate beings to desire some end that is appropriate to their nature, what is the thing that God desires? And what subject does he employ his mental activity and reason? And lastly, how is he happy? And how eternal? In the Stoic cosmology, the ultimate end is the endlessly reoccurring cycle according to law. That Stoic cosmology was the same thing as what was called Middle Platonism. And it was Middle Platonism that grabbed Philo of Alexandria. It wasn't Plato. There's over 300 years in between them. There's Middle Platonism, on which there are almost no books. Almost nobody wants to talk about it. Because Middle Platonism, with its Stoic cosmology, is a can of worms. And it's good reason why the Vatican left Book 6 out of De Republica. Because all of these things are very potent and poignant, because they all surface at the same time. Now we happen to have, because it was also written as a literary poem, another complete view of the Stoic cosmology, and that is Lucretius de Rerum Natura, the nature of the universe. Epicurean cosmology. What does he say in here? We went through some of this on Sunday, or on Saturday. We talked about, I guess we don't have time to go into all this. It seemed that there was so much in our contemporary age that has the same kind of quality as this. Matter is indestructible. It holds all things together through the fastenings. Everything varies. Otherwise, a touch, the merest touch, would be a cause of death, a force sufficient to dissolve an air, textures of mortal substances. But here's the fact: the elements are held, bound together in different degrees by the basic stuff, is indestructible, so things remain intact, unharmed, until a force is found proportionate to their texture, to effect reversion to their primal elements, but never to complete annihilation. And so on. Again, the same dull round, the same kind of lawfulness. It is this that early Christianity in its churchiness tended to revert back to. Tended to go back and just amplify and change the terms, but go back to the comfortable old world that was there before. John Mark couldn't stand that. He left Paul and Andrew in the midst of a voyage. They were sailing from Rhodes to the mainland of Asia Minor, probably not more than a couple, 3 hours worth of sailing. And in that couple of 3 hours, he decided he was not going to go with them. And he went back. He went back to Antioch because he knew about Antioch. And at Antioch, he teamed up with Peter. And it was with Peter that they decided to go to Rome. And John Mark was the amanuensis. He was the private secretary of Peter in Rome. And they went to Rome, and it was a very dangerous situation, because the early Christians, the Galileans, they were sometimes called, were rebels. They were not welcome. They were not welcome as Jews, and they were not welcome as heretical Jews, and they were not welcome as rebels. And so the early Christian community in Rome, under Peter, with John Mark, was an esoteric underground community, literally underground. We have a book here published about 120 years ago that has engravings of the catacomb drawings and symbols, and all the way in there, you do not see the cross that has the bottom elongated. You have the equal cross as a self symbol. That the transformation is not to death, but to eternal life. That's the transformation. Who makes money on the fact that you're supposed to be protected by the transformation through death? If you look at the letters of Paul, especially Romans, there's a lot in Corinthians too, and we'll get to it, but in Romans, he says that the only way that we can join Jesus is through his death. It sounds good on the surface. That he has gone through death and we must give our allegiance to him through the church so that we are resurrected through the church structure, through our affinity to him. Mark says, there are many who are going to come in my name. Don't believe them. Don't have anything to do with this. That the transformation is individual, and it's the individual that goes through this, not through immediate structure, because all these immediate structures are already splayed out and amplified according to ruts that have run so deep in history that we had to change it. All of this happened, and all of this was done by 70 A.D. It was a fait accompli by 70 A.D. All of this was completed. These polarities were set into place. These variants were set into place. The esoteric traditions were already beginning to come alive again. And from 70 A.D., when the temple was destroyed, was like adding fuel to this fire. Because those who had sought to align themselves with the new understanding of the temple suddenly were left out in the open. There was no more temple. It was completely destroyed. It was never built again. Temple Judaism came to a dead end in 70 A.D. There never again has ever been a temple Judaism. Rabbinic Judaism came out of that. The Talmud, the Mishnahs. And the Christian church structure solidifies itself. And so after 70 A.D., there's an increasing tendency for those who had transformed, who had changed, to keep themselves free of this complication. And more the description was that the demonic lord of this world has truly netted everybody into his scam. And you have to keep yourself free from this in any way that you can. But that there is a way of transformation where this salvation, this soteriological event can happen, and from there is no backsliding. One need never worry after that. And so the term Savior comes in. And it's interesting that the word esoteric and soteric are very much the same word. Only one has an E in front of it. But Jesus as a Savior is different from Jesus as a rabbi. That the experience of gnosis is different from a church structure. Is different. In the one has a religious community. I think the Greek term is ecclesia. One has a religious community. In the other one has a theological doctrine which owns property. And that's different. It's a totally different experience. And the whole of the 2nd century A.D. is a war between these viewpoints. And increasingly, because of the tremendous dynamic in here, because it wasn't an issue of a neighborhood or of a region or of just a sect of human beings, because these are universal problems. This is the universal problem. It sucked into itself the whole Roman Empire. It wasn't a question of popularity Christianity did not win popularity contests. Mithraism would have won the popularity contest. It was that the dynamic of truthful recognition and reality was all bound up in Christianity. And the whole of the ancient world was simply evaporated into the issues that Christianity had generated. So that by the early 4th century, there was no longer any question of a classical tradition without a Christian understanding, a Christian hermeneutic, one way or another. And of course, we'll see that the church structure, in order to foster itself, has to stamp out competition. It has to bring the reins of transformation into a theological understanding, into a doctrinal position, and the creation of a single New Testament is the most glaring example of a repetition in the old rut. That there was an Old Testament, and now there is a New Testament, and we're going to be loyal, good church members to the New Testament like our forefathers were loyal to the Old Testament. But there's another testament. That transformation really occurs, and that in that vision there's no such thing as death. There's no such thing as demonic energies. There's no such thing as some god of this world who has to be kowtowed to. That's different. And it was that freedom that had its home in Alexandria. And we're going to see all the way through that that tradition was raised to the highest levels of human attainment right there in Alexandria, and all within about 250 years. Well, that's about as far as we can go tonight. Thanks for coming out on an evening like this.